well. We are starting this new series today called Faith Without Fear, looking at our faith and asking, if we start not from fear, but from love, might our faith look a little different? Spoiler alert, yes, it will, right? So today, the topic we're engaging with is God without fear. Just a small topic for us this morning. But first, a confession from my own life. When I was a little kid, there's this prayer that you learn. Some of you may have grown up with it as well. You prayed this prayer that says something like, if I die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul to take, right? Which is just an absolute banger of a thing to teach a 6-year-old before the lights go out at night. Sleep tight, kiddo, right? But I prayed it earnestly because somewhere along the way I picked up that God was watching and keeping score. And if I wasn't right with God before I fell asleep, that I might just wake up in the wrong neighborhood. You know what I mean? And so I'd say this prayer earnestly, and then I'd lie there going back over the day, just making sure that I'd said sorry for everything. And sorry if I forgot anything to say sorry for too, right? Just in case. And that was the God that I knew growing up. And just to be clear, I was loved. It was a loving household. No one really told me to be afraid of God. I just absorbed it. It was in the air and in the way that we saw God. And I don't think I'm alone. I think many of us are still walking around with that 6-year-old's God in a 46-year-old's body. A lot of things in our world start to make sense when we realize that. Because here's what I've come to believe, that the picture that you carry of God, the picture that you carry with you in your head, whether you chose it or whether you just absorbed it, shapes you deeply. How you see the world, how you see yourself, how you pray, how you treat the people you like and the people you don't, whether you see yourself as beloved or barely tolerated. And in ways that we don't even notice, the kind of world that we seek to build and be a part of together. And many of us got handed a picture of God that came more from fear than from love. And so in this series, we're going to seek to do something about that. And this series alone will not do it. I see a counselor on a regular basis, and so there's lots of ways to engage with this as well too. But in this series, we're going to seek to let love tell a different story. Because we believe love has a different story to tell. We believe that the good news of God's love is actually good. It's not just a threat dressed up in Sunday best, right? And so our anchor verse for this series comes from the community around John that wrote this. And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. And there is no fear, they continue, in love. But perfect love drives out fear. Fear has to do with punishment, and love drives out fear. God is love. Yeah, I could just stop there for the day and we could go on, right? 3 words, God is love. If we actually meant that, if we let that go all the way down to the roots of us, everything begins to reorder. That's not a line on a greeting card. It is a claim about the ultimate nature of reality. That is a claim that we can lay our heads on at night and find rest, because whatever else God is at the center of everything, what we find is love. Not love as one of God's attributes, but love as the thing God is. Which means that every other thing that we say about God has to fit underneath those 3 words. And anything that doesn't belong with God. And so what do we mean when we say love, right? Because here's where it gets tricky. Love is one of the most diffuse words in the English language. I love my wife, and I love ice cream, right? They are not the same thing. There is a Venn diagram in which they overlap, but they are not the same thing. So when I say God is love, like, what do we mean by that? In Greek, there are several words for love, and the community around John picked a very specific one. They wrote, Theos agape estin. God is love. God is agape love. Agape is not warm fuzzies. Agape is divine, universal, unconditional, unfailing, unchanging love. And a couple of weeks ago, I was reminded of just how profound this thought is. So I'd been preaching about 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that wedding passage. You may have heard it before. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not arrogant or rude. It goes on, right? And afterwards, my friend Jim Mitchell came up to me and said, Jonathan, I assume that the word Paul uses in that chapter is agape, isn't it? The divine kind of love. And I said, Jim, you are exactly right. And for a few minutes, we just explored what to do with that. Because friends, do you realize what that means for us? That passage that Paul wrote isn't just a wedding reading, it is theology. Paul is describing the very character of God, a portrait of God hidden in plain sight. And so let's read 1 Corinthians 13 again slowly. And everywhere that Paul says love, I'm going to put the word God in its place. Because if God is love, then by the transitive property of agape, kids, remember that when you get to your STAR test this next week, right? By the transitive property of agape, we can read it like this. God is patient. God is kind. God is not arrogant or rude. God does not insist on God's own way. God keeps no record of wrongs. God bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. God never ends. God is love. And that just might be one of the most radical things anyone ever wrote about God. God does not insist on God's own way. The God of the entire universe, who could make us do anything, right, does not insist. God invites. God reaches out. But God does not force the door. Because love does not force. The moment love starts coercing, it stops being love. God keeps no record of wrongs. My 6-year-old self could have really used that one, right? Kid who was running through the checklist, who was adding that postscript prayer just in case. God was not keeping a list that I was afraid God was keeping. Paul says so plain as day. And there's so much to unpack there. We'll do that over the next few Sundays. But for now, just resting in that truth at the heart of everything. God is love. It's transformative. If that's really who God is, then know this. That whenever you experience something that is not loving, it is not of God. No matter how it's packaged or what preacher says it. If it is coercive, it is not of God. If it is abusive or protects abuse, it is not of God. If it divides, it is not divine. If it excludes, it is not God's all-welcoming, unconditional, universal love. If it isn't loving, it isn't God. But if it is agape love, it is. So whenever I talk about love, sometimes folks go, isn't that just like an easier version of God? I don't think so. I think, in fact, that this is the more grown-up version of God. I think it's deeper. I think it's more difficult. I think it's more mature. And if you've ever tried to really love someone, you kind of know that. But when I say more mature, I think of this. So there was an academic theologian by the name of James Fowler who spent his entire academic career on this one question: how does our faith grow up? He wrote a seminal book called Stages of Faith. It's built on hundreds of interviews across a wide range of faith traditions. And what Fowler found is that faith develops through some recognizable stages. And as our faith develops, so does the picture that we carry of God. In the earliest stages of our life, Fowler describes them as the mythic literal faith. God is that powerful, magic, cosmic, literal authority. God is the scorekeeper who keeps a list and checks it twice, right? That was the God I was praying to when I was 6 years old. And in some ways, we never fully leave that stage along the way. We just might dress it up in better church branding, right? But as faith matures, Fowler traces this progression, that it goes through this progression. And one stage he calls the individuative reflective faith, where you start to think of it for yourself and reflect on it. You start asking hard questions and tearing apart what you inherited. And then through that wrestling season, there's the conjunctive faith, which, despite how that word sounds, is a positive thing, where things come back together and conjoin again. Paradox is no longer the enemy. The symbols and stories return in new ways to us, richer and deeper and more mature than before. And the picture of God that emerges is no longer the scorekeeper, but the God whose arms are open to us, a God who starts to look an awful lot like love itself. But Fowler's research didn't stop there. He found one more stage, and it is the rarest and deepest and most demanding. He called it universalizing faith. Because the people who reached that stage had let their faith mature all the way to something extraordinary. The principles of their faith, love, joy, peace, kindness, were understood as very universal attributes of God, the fabric of the cosmos, a love so universal, so without boundaries, that those who found it were willing to spend themselves on it. It wasn't a nicer theology. It was a fearless, rooted, radical enactment of faith backed by this picture of God is love that extended to all of life. And Fowler's word for these people was not soft. His word was subversive. Because faith built on universal love overturns every structure that coerces, every power that depends on dividing people into us and them. These people challenged unloving systems and were willing to give their lives for it, because it is what God is. And when Fowler began to ask whose faith actually looks like this, he began to gather a list. Dr. Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Not soft people. People whose hearts were soft at their core. but people whose picture of God was so rooted in love that it made them subversive to the status quo. Faith was their whole life, universal and inseparable from how they ate and slept and prayed and marched and bled. It ran all the way through them and came out as life. It walked Dr. King onto the bridge at Selma. It walked Mother Teresa into the slums of Calcutta. It walked Gandhi face to face with empire, and it walked Christ to the cross of Golgotha. None of them got softer as their faith matured. They got deeper, more committed, more rooted, because the love they found at the center of God became the love they had to live in and the love they had to give away every day, all day, to all people, no exceptions. And so when I tell you that God is love, unfortunately, this is not handing us an easier religion, right? It hands us the one that the saints gave their lives to. And yet, you turn on the news right now, do it at your own peril, because you see a version of Christianity and of faith that is loud in our world right now that looks nothing like that list. It doesn't look like Dr. King. It doesn't look like Mother Teresa. And it doesn't look much like Jesus either. It's built around fear. Fear of losing power, privilege, status. Thus, fear of immigrants, women, LGBTQ plus folks, Muslims, anyone who seems different. And that fear-based Christianity is busy building walls and cages and wars and lists and baptizing it all. It's the 6-year-old's God, scaled up and handed the keys of public power. And friends, that is not the God we meet in Jesus. It's not the God who is love. It's not the God that Jesus showed us when he sat down with the wrong people and forgave the unforgivable and told stories about this universal, unconditional, loving God who sprinted down the road to embrace a prodigal son with universal love. Walter Brueggemann puts it like this. He says, when we live according to our fears and our hates, our lives become small and defensive, lacking the deep, joyous generosity of God. Small and defensive versus deep and joyous generosity. This is not just to point outward. There's those moments where I feel small and defensive. In those moments, it's a great chance to check myself and to remember what Brueggemann says next. He says, life with God is much, much bigger. Now is the time, he says, for yielding justice, for foolish forgiveness, for outrageous generosity, for elaborate hospitality. None of these acts can come from fear, but they are all acts that evoke new futures that the fearful think are impossible. New futures that the fearful think are impossible, love makes possible. A God whose first name is love makes possible. A God whose first name is love does not build walls. That God builds tables. Tables of relationship, tables of community, tables of connection, tables of welcome and love. And tables are where impossible futures begin. And friends, that is who we seek to be and what we seek to live into here. We're not a perfect community, but we seek to be a community letting our picture of God mature into love and letting that love come out from underneath those prayer time covers and step out into a world that is tired of being afraid. Because love makes new futures possible. Every time we show up to sit with a kid or to talk with a family at Carolyn Book Care, love is making a new future. Every time we stand with a neighbor walking into an immigration hearing, love is making a new future. Every time we welcome each other, every time we open the door wider, every time we listen to each other, every time we choose presence over walking past, love is making a new future possible. A love that is not soft, that is not safe, that is not small. That is the new future of the kingdom of the God who is love, breaking in, quietly, stubbornly, one act of outrageous, deep, joyous generosity at a time. That is what it looks like when people stop being defensive and start being generous. When fear lets go and love takes over, when a church decides to love its neighbor instead of being afraid of each other. This, friends, creates the kind of community where a new future is possible. The kind of community where 6-year-olds and 60-year-old bodies can finally find rest. Where love is not a slogan, but a practice. Agape lived out in potlucks and text messages and showing up to the hospital and standing in the gap for each other when no one else will. And our world needs it, and our neighbors need it, and the ones being called unwelcome need it, and those of us still apologizing to God in the dark need it. And the 6-year-olds in our church and the 6-year-olds in ourselves need it too. And so we, Arapaho, imperfect, ordinary, wonderful, and amazing us, get to help build it. So come, friends, take this love in and then carry it out. Letting love create new futures for all people. May love grow up in us. May fear be cast out. And may we, for now and forever, be people who build a world that looks more and more like the God whose first name is love. Let's pray.